Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Franckowiak, a biological science technician for the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program, and I'd like to thank you for participating and listening to my presentation. Today's presentation is about disease surveillance and management of urban pigs in Puerto Rico. As many may know, centuries after their introduction into the US mainland in the 1500s, feral pigs have come to be a species of concern in our country. And this is primarily due to the impacts to the environment, agriculture, and disease risk to humans, wildlife, and livestock. Due to their behavioral flexibility, adaptability, and high reproductive rates, feral swine are now found in approximately 40 states, including 3 US territories. But we're not the only North American country dealing with this problem. Our Canadian neighbors are also battling this destructive species and their growth. Now, Eurasian boar were first introduced into Canada in the 1980s and 90s as an incentive for producers to diversify their livestock. Escapees and intentional release of these animals has now resulted in well-established populations in several Canadian provinces. But what about the areas outside of the US mainland, such as the Caribbean islands? Stories from the 14 and 1500s tell that during European expeditions, some pigs were dropped off on the islands by sailors and explorers so they could reproduce and use as a future food source. Pigs were also raised and traded between these islands, in addition to being imported and exported to what some would call the New and Old World. But not only has the presence of hogs been troubling on the US mainland, there are also problematic situations in these islands as well. Moving forward to today, the presence of wild pigs on these islands, many of which are tourist destinations, have become a burden to wildlife managers and health officials alike. As many may know, wild pigs tend to have negative ecological impact, especially on islands where endemic flora and fauna are present. They can damage public and private property as well, and may pose a risk to human beings, either through aggression or through a disease. Now, one of these Caribbean locations, as you may have guessed, is Puerto Rico, which is located between the US Virgin Islands and the Dominican Republic, about 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers southeast of Florida. And since late last year in 2020, there have been many internet articles about the prevalence of swine on this island. So how do swine play a role in Puerto Rico? Well, much of the local and tourist food is comprised of pork products, primarily from commercial domestic swine that we know, the livestock species. Many of these swine are housed in small pens near houses and in small farms. And pork is a large part of the culture here. Across Puerto Rico, you can find pork-specific food stands on the side of the road, offering pork products to any passerby. And now for several years prior to 2017, a new fad or trend in Puerto Rico started occurring, and that was having another pig species on the island, Vietnamese potbelly pigs as pets. And even though they might be cute as small pests, the species can grow up to 250 pounds and sometimes even larger. But why did I specifically point out 2017? That's because in 2017, Hurricane Maria, a deadly Category 5 hurricane, devastated the islands of Dominica, St. Croix, and Puerto Rico. This was regarded as the worst natural disaster in recorded history to affect those specific islands. It was also the deadliest hurricane since Hurricane Mitch nearly 20 years prior in 1998. Now, if you look at the images, you can see that many residents were displaced from their homes. There was disastrous flooding, and the homes and buildings were just ultimately destroyed from Hurricane Maria. Now, due to the damage caused by the hurricane and the hardship of Puerto Rico's citizens, these Vietnamese potbelly pigs either escaped or were released from their enclosures. Several years later, these pigs are now comfortable inhabiting heavily urbanized areas in which they can find refuge and shelter under the debris caused by Hurricane Maria. And while there's no official numbers, it's estimated that there are now thousands of pigs roaming across the island of Puerto Rico, with 67 of 78 municipalities on this island reporting sightings of feral potbelly pigs. So how does the presence of these pigs affect the residents of Puerto Rico? Well, as you can see from the images, the overabundance of these pigs, primarily in the urban landscapes, has resulted in them eating plants from residents' landscaping, from their porches and in gardens. They knock over trash cans and they consume the waste and the trash that falls out of them. They can occasionally be aggressive as well and bite at humans, and they also urinate and defecate in areas of high human activity, such as on sidewalks or in playgrounds. And what some may ask is, if Puerto Rican residents already eat swine, why don't they eat these Vietnamese potbelly pigs? Well, it's a result of the meat not being very desirable, either fatty or too salty. On top of that, these animals are primarily seen as a pest species on the island. And the meat is not very favorable to consume when you have groups of pigs eating trash, such as leftover expired food items that they knock out of the trash cans, dirty diapers, or any miscellaneous trash. So it's not going to be very favorable for anyone to want to eat. But nonetheless, the occurrence of these pigs has been so overwhelming in this US territory of Puerto Rico declared a public health emergency in 2019. So then federal officials can begin eradicating them. Given the declared state of emergency regarding feral pigs in Puerto Rico, the USDA Wildlife Services were tasked with eradicating these pigs, primarily in urban communities within the municipality of San Juan. Now, the initial large-scale efforts occurred in August of 2019. However, Wildlife Services also provided additional support March of this year in 2020. Now, Wildlife Services used the dispatch to remove pigs for disease surveillance on the island. And this is important because you can monitor the health of the animals to address any pathogens that can be transmitted to humans, pets, wildlife, or livestock on the island. We also collected genetic samples as a supplemental goal to address any questions about these pigs in the future. Now, Wildlife Services already performs disease surveillance on dispatched feral swine throughout the country. And just to give a little bit of background to that, during feral swine management efforts, removing pigs from the population, Wildlife Services collects serum and genetic samples nationwide, including the US territories of Guam, US Virgin Islands, and as you can tell, Puerto Rico. And these are targeted surveillance efforts with samples dispersed over space and time. And samples are collected from areas where existing feral swine populations already occur, locations near domestic swine facility, and also from feral swine that reside near landfill. As of October 1st, 2020, Wildlife Services has collected samples from over 3,300 feral swine across the US already. And what we try to monitor is the presence of classical swine fever, pseudorabies virus, and swine brucellosis. These national efforts of serological diagnostics allow us to gain an understanding of feral swine health status across the whole US. And it helps biologists look for evidence of its historic exposure of disease across the US mainland as well. But for back to Puerto Rico, when it came time to collect or conduct the removal of these pigs, local communities showed incredible support in our efforts to remove the potbelly pigs. Now, large corral traps were established within these communities. To condition hogs to entering the trap, these urban pigs were fed within the trap for 2 to 3 weeks. And as you could tell by the video, they could be easily conditioned to entering the trap just by banging on a 5-gallon bucket. Now, keep in mind, look at the placement of this corral trap. Our methods in Puerto Rico did not follow the normal blueprint in swine management as performed in other areas of the US, where you can obtain landowner permission, the feral swine are then trapped, typically in remote areas, and then they're immediately removed, euthanized, and samples would be collected. But for us, our efforts were performed in the eye of the public, having corral traps even along streets and in parks. Now, when the removal process began, pigs were not just immediately euthanized. When they were trapped in corral traps, they were then able to be loaded up into a trailer and removed from the area by truck. And then they were taken to a location where they were euthanized and disease samples were collected, and then they were buried at an off-site location. Similar to our national efforts, disease surveillance was conducted to detect pathogens that could pose a risk to human humans, wildlife, and livestock on the island. Using the Wildlife Services already existing national surveillance approach, we want to expand our efforts and knowledge for disease monitoring in Puerto Rico. So we also look here for classical swine fever, pseudorabies virus, and swine brucellosis. Now, monitoring diseases in Puerto Rico can be very important, as commercial swine operations here tend to be a little bit different than what we see in the US mainland. And that comes down to limited biosecurity. Due to a lack of these biosecurity measures, it can be assumed that it is not uncommon for commercial domestic pigs that are in small pens next to someone's house, like what you see here in the upper right-hand corner image. Now, this may not be uncommon for these pigs to make direct contact with the feral Vietnamese pigs and increase the likelihood for disease transmission. Now, so that was the 2019 efforts. In 2021, we still look for the same three diseases: classical swine fever, pseudorabies virus, and swine brucellosis. But we bolstered our disease surveillance program this year in 2021, and we looked for signs of foot and mouth disease. We looked for influenza A virus, and we did antigen-based diagnostics for classical swine fever testing as well. And one important thing that we looked for this year in 2021 is trying to detect and monitor for African swine fever. Now, African swine fever is a disease where monitoring its spread is a high priority globally. Several decades ago in the 70s, ASF was already present and detected in the Caribbean islands. And unfortunately, there were many reports of illegal movement of swine in the Caribbean, which increases the opportunity for this disease to spread and be detected once again in this region. And currently, under existing policies, any introduction of ASF anywhere in the US would result in an immediate stop to international trade. Therefore, the ramifications of African swine fever detection would affect the entire United States, even if it's only found in Puerto Rico. So how many disease samples do we need, given the number of swine that are known in these communities? So to discern the number of disease samples needed, Wildlife Services worked with the partners at the Veterinary Services Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health to generate a sample size graph that indicates an appropriate number of disease samples to be collected given the population or the census removed. So therefore, our target number for disease surveillance, the sample size for seroprevalence, is predicated on the number of pigs that are actually removed from the community. Now, much like Wildlife Services efforts nationwide, whole blood collected from dispatched pigs and, much like our services nationwide, my apologies, whole blood is spun down into serum and centrifuges, so we can collect the serum and send them to diagnostic labs for testing. For detecting influenza A virus, nasal swabs were used on dispatched pigs, and whole blood cells were collected whole blood was collected for PCR tests for CSF and ASF. In addition, the hooves and the tongues were observed for lesions to try to detect foot and mouth disease. In addition, we also collect ear clips from dispatched feral swine, so we can do some genetic sampling on them. Now, where did these samples go? The whole blood samples for classical swine fever and African swine fever and influenza A virus nasal swabs are sent straight from Puerto Rico to the Rollins lab in North Carolina for testing. All serum samples that were collected are shipped straight to the National Wildlife Research Center for processing and logging. After that occurs and all the data is QC'd and we look at the samples, then the samples meant for classical swine fever testing are sent to the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Laboratory in New York. Our pseudorabies virus and our swine brucellosis samples are then sent to the Federal Brucellosis Laboratory in Kentucky for testing. In addition, we also collect additional serum and genetic samples to be archived here at the National Wildlife Research Center. And these samples can be used for future analyses that may be needed, such as looking for diseases such as leptospirosis per se. And here at the National Wildlife Research Center of Fort Collins, we host the largest feral swine archive on the planet. Now, what did we do? Our initial efforts in 2009 resulted in over 500 pigs, 521 pigs, free-ranging pigs, being removed from the community. Similarly, in 2021, our efforts showed that we were able to remove 540 pigs throughout a 5-day trapping event. Now, if you look at that graph that I showed earlier of how many samples we wanted to collect, around 500 pigs removed, we were looking to obtain around 121 samples for disease surveillance. But while performing these, we were almost able to double that. So as you can see in 2019, we were able to collect about 250 samples from these dispatched pigs. And what we found was that we had no occurrence, no detection of any classical swine fever or of swine brucellosis. However, out of 249 samples tested, only one sample showed positive for pseudorabies virus, coming out to about 0.4% of all the samples that were collected. In 2021, we had similar results. For antibody-based diagnostics, we did not detect any classical swine fever or swine brucellosis, but we also detected, had one positive pseudorabies virus. And for our antigen-based diagnostics, we did not detect any classical swine fever, no influenza A virus, and fortunately, no African swine fever. We also detected no signs of foot and mouth disease for all the pigs that we observed as well. We were looking for lesions on their tongue and in their hooves. So in conclusion, Wildlife Services is going to continue managing feral pig numbers in Puerto Rico and fulfilling its mission to protect agriculture, wildlife, other natural resources, property, and more importantly, human health and safety. These eradication efforts result in the reduced numbers or reduced rooting of yards and of properties, damage to local plants, destruction of park areas, and hopefully reduce the opportunity for pigs to spread waste everywhere by knocking over trash cans and making a mess. The reduction of feral pigs here, it will also allow for the protection of crops by reducing the loss of plants in gardens, plants that are kept in yards, and local fruits, things that people would like to consume on the island. In human safety, reduced numbers of pigs can lessen the possibility of human-swine conflict or swine and pet conflicts exhibited through aggression, such as charging or biting at humans and pets, especially in areas such as parks where children tend to play. By reducing the number of feral pigs in these urbanized landscape, we can minimize the opportunity of disease transmission to humans, pets, wildlife, and livestock here. We're very fortunate that both in 2019 and 2021, only one sample each of those years were found positive for any disease, and that was pseudorabies virus. However, by contributing to the National Wildlife or the National Disease Surveillance Program in our efforts and sampling these pigs, we can continually monitor diseases such as classical swine fever and ASF, African swine fever, that have previously been detected on Caribbean islands and can affect some of the commercial swine industry here in this area. Again, an introduction of African swine fever would result in an immediate stop to international trade, and the ramifications that would occur would just stop all trade in the US, even if it's only found in Puerto Rico. So throughout our efforts, Wildlife Services has taken a proactive and not reactive response in monitoring the diseases in these feral pigs to ensure that any illegal movement and the associated disease transmission, does not result in the crippling of any the US pork industry or to affect the residents of Puerto Rico and their livelihood. And we're going to keep expanding our surveillance and our management of these feral pigs eventually all over the island. And with that, I would like to thank you, everyone, for listening to my program today. Most definitely a great thanks to all the field staff for the dedication and their hard work with these eradication and disease efforts in Puerto Rico. I would also like to thank the Wildlife Damage Management Conference for allowing me to speak today. And again, I would just like to thank all of you for having an interest and and wanting to know more about the efforts of removing pigs by wildlife services and the disease surveillance in areas other than the US mainland. So thank you.